The French economy is at a crossroads that many people saw coming but hoped would never arrive. At first glance, you might notice high GDP, a robust business sector, and a long track record of global influence in Europe and beyond. However, beneath that surface, there's a convergence of political strife, unwieldy levels of public spending, and a rapidly escalating national debt. Recent events have pushed the government to the brink, affecting not just the country's political stability, but the entire Eurozone. The question everyone is asking is, how did France get here, and can it steer away from a dangerous spiral? Right now, France is grappling with debt estimated at well over 3 trillion euros. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is around 112%, which breaks the European Union's recommended limits by a huge margin. While some countries have also run afoul of these guidelines, France stands out because of its historically large public sector, its inability to curb deficits over many years, and its intense political divisions. During more stable periods, this challenge may have been manageable, but when the government itself is on the edge of collapse, the slightest push can trigger economic anxieties across Europe. Over the past few months, parliamentarians in France have come to loggerheads over how to pass a budget that addresses ballooning deficits. On paper, this doesn't sound like a novel dilemma. Many nations must sometimes navigate arguments over tax hikes or cuts to social spending. But France's predicament is bigger than a typical budget battle. It has an immense social safety net, pensions, healthcare benefits, unemployment programs, that people have come to regard as a basic right. For decades, politicians of every stripe recognized how deeply these programs were woven into daily life, and mostly avoided cutting them for fear of massive backlash. That fear has now clashed with economic reality. As growth remains sluggish, tax receipts fall short of targets, and debt servicing costs grow, France is facing a genuine budget crisis. By the time you factor in the possibility of new global trade disputes or tariffs, particularly if U.S. policy changes direction, France risks sliding into a situation reminiscent of the Eurozone crisis that rocked the continent about 15 years ago. In a worst-case scenario, that would send shockwaves far beyond France's borders. At the center of the current storm is a struggle in the National Assembly over how to move forward with major austerity measures. Some politicians argue that austerity is critical for restoring fiscal discipline, pointing out that the country's deficit is now above 6% of GDP, double the already lenient allowances of the EU. Others counter that people are still wrestling with the aftermath of the pandemic and should not be saddled with sudden pension reforms or cutbacks to healthcare and social spending. There are also proposals for raising taxes on large corporations or reversing recent corporate tax cuts, but that alone can't fix the problem if government expenditures remain enormous. It's not just the deficit that alarms observers, it's also the structural nature of the French economy. France has long boasted some of the world's highest worker productivity. If you look purely at output per hour, it can actually hold its own against other major economies, even the United States. But the French have fewer total hours worked due to the 35-hour work week, generous annual leave, and a cultural emphasis on quality of life. This can make raw GDP figures appear smaller than they might if workers put in longer hours. High productivity is generally a sign of a healthy economy, yet it can mask other deep-rooted concerns. One of those concerns is that much of France's corporate landscape consists of either very large, often state-favored companies or small firms that do their utmost never to exceed 49 employees. At 50 and above, they face additional labor regulations that many would rather avoid. This discourages some businesses from scaling up, which potentially hinders growth and innovation. Meanwhile, established giants in sectors such as energy, automotive, and banking are often shielded by regulations or political lobbying, making it harder for new rivals to enter and compete. Some people point to France's strong investment culture as a sign of hope. Over the past decade, there's been a noticeable rise in private sector investment as a percentage of GDP, fueled partly by policies designed to attract foreign capital. Government investment has also generally exceeded that of many peer economies, ensuring decent infrastructure and strong public services. The argument goes that, thanks to ongoing public and private investment, France is better equipped to weather economic disruptions, such as the transition away from fossil fuels or the reverberations of global conflict. At the same time, if no workable budget passes, the money for large-scale projects could dry up or come at an ever higher cost of borrowing. In the past few years, French leadership attempted to address the country's structural problems head-on, but each attempt at reform sparked mass protests. Proposals to raise the retirement age triggered widespread demonstrations, as did efforts to reduce certain subsidies and entitlements. Voters were torn. On one hand, they recognized the need to rein in spending and reduce the towering deficit. On the other, many felt a real sense of betrayal at the prospect of losing the country's hallmark social protections. After all, these are the programs that kept people afloat not just during the pandemic, but across decades of economic volatility. One area where this crisis might also prove consequential is foreign policy and Europe-wide coordination. France has traditionally played an active role on the global stage, whether in mediating conflicts, asserting leadership in the EU alongside Germany, or shaping NATO's long-term strategy. If its government is mired in domestic political chaos, it's harder for French leaders to devote attention to broader challenges, such as the war in Ukraine or escalating Middle East tensions. Germany, likewise heading to the polls in due time, is contending with its own economic hurdles, and that leaves a leadership void in the European project. Ultimately, France's ability to navigate its current predicament depends on finding a political path forward that can hold a majority in the National Assembly. It must deliver enough fiscal responsibility to calm the markets while satisfying a public that has grown distrustful of deep budget cuts. That's no easy task when the far left and the far right can unite against whichever prime minister the president taps next. Yet, for the sake of stability and the well-being of millions of citizens, a workable compromise must be found. For now, France stands at a critical juncture. Can it reform its big-ticket spending areas, pensions, benefits, healthcare, without igniting social chaos? Can it raise revenue without scaring away businesses or placing an even heavier burden on households? And can it do all this under the leadership of a parliament and president whose visions might differ sharply? The world will be watching. If the country manages to untangle this knot, it will be living proof that large economies with robust social models can adapt and thrive. But if it fails, the repercussions will go well beyond one prime minister losing a job or one president failing to push legislation through. They'll echo throughout the European Union and, in time, the global economy. I hope this comprehensive explanation helps clarify the situation. The aim here was to detail the reasons behind France's economic and political challenges, and the far-reaching impacts they could have on Europe and beyond. These intricate connections remind us once again how deeply intertwined global economies truly are. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to exploring another pressing topic in depth in our next video. Until then, take care.